Imagine a road, not just a strip of land, but a living, hostile creature. August 1944, somewhere east of Minsk. The road breathes incandescent dust that sears the lungs, crunches between the teeth, and turns sweat into a crust of filth. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, a former history teacher from Leipzig, wasn't looking at the road. He was looking through it. His eyes, once clear and gray, had become two faded slits in a mask of dust and suffering. He had long since lost count of the days. Time had blurred into a single endless cycle. Dawn, heat, dusk, cold. The sun was not a star, but an executioner. It burned away the last remnants of strength, evaporated the moisture from their bodies, turning men into walking parchment. To his left, a man stumbled and fell. No one turned back. The column, this gray, many-legged caterpillar, did not even slow its pace. It simply flowed over the fallen body like a river over a stone. A guard, a tired boy with a rifle, gave a lazy wave of his hand. In a couple of hours, the rear cart would pick him up, or it wouldn't. It no longer mattered. For the man who fell, the war was over. Klaus Richter forced himself to take another step. His feet, rubbed raw to the living flesh, moved on inertia, obeying not his will but some ancient animal instinct. Move or die. He was not a history teacher. He was a mechanism composed of pain, thirst, and a single memory, the face of his wife Elsa, which grew fainter with each passing day. Beside him, breathing heavily, trudged Feldwebel Gunther, an old soldier whose face resembled a map of cracked earth. He said nothing. Words had run out long ago. Only wheezes and coughs remained. On the roadside, in the shadow of the twisted wreck of a Tiger tank, sat a young soldier, staring into the void. His eyes were made of glass. He was no longer there. His soul had been left behind somewhere in a burning forest near Bobruisk. Richter knew that look. It was the look of a man who had surrendered, not to the enemy, but to himself. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Hunger was not just a feeling. It was a beast gnawing at his organs from the inside. Thirst was a fire scorching his throat. But the most terrible enemy was despair. It was quiet, insidious. It whispered in the night that everything was meaningless, that ahead lay only the same dusty road, the same scorching heat, and the same slow, humiliating death. Richter forced himself to lift his head. Ahead, stretching to the horizon, swayed a gray sea of thousands just like him, broken, empty, stripped of names and ranks, just prisoners, material, a statistic in some future report. But to understand how an officer of the German army, a holder of the Iron Cross, had been reduced to a barely living automaton of walking, we must go back 45 days. To that suffocating July day when the hell they themselves had brought to this land came crashing down upon their own heads, and the world as they knew it ceased to exist. July 1944, the forests near Minsk. The air was thick and humid like damp wool. It smelled of rotting leaves, gunpowder, and fear. Army Group Center, once the iron fist that was to crush the Soviet Union, had been shattered into torn, bleeding fragments scattered across the Belarusian swamps and forests. The cauldron. A terrible word that soldiers spoke only in whispers. It wasn't just a tactical map with arrows. It was a grave. A living, breathing grave that was slowly contracting, grinding divisions into a bloody pulp. In a small, hastily dug out, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter tried to write a letter. The paper was damp with sweat and the pencil lead kept breaking. "My dearest Elsa," he wrote, "all is well here. The weather is warm. Soon, I hope, we will receive orders to relocate to a quieter sector." A lie. A shameless, desperate lie. Beyond the log walls of the dugout, there was nothing well. There was the incessant roar of Soviet artillery that hadn't let them sleep for 3 days. There were the screams of the wounded, with nothing to treat them. And there was silence. The silence of the radio waves. Army Group Command was not responding. There was no contact. They were alone. His platoon, or rather what was left of it, 18 men out of 45, was holding a tiny patch of ground. Around them was the forest, and in the forest was the enemy, everywhere. Next to Richter, Feldwebel Gunther sat methodically cleaning his rifle. He was over 50. He had fought in the First World War and viewed everything with the fatalism of an old soldier. "The main thing, Lieutenant," he would sometimes say in his gravelly bass, "is to keep your barrel clean. Everything else is from the devil." In the corner, huddled in a ball, sat Erich, a young corporal from Berlin. He'd been here since 41. He'd seen it all. The triumphant marches and the mountains of corpses near Moscow. He no longer believed in anything. not in the Führer, not in victory, not in God. He believed only that they would all die here. "They're just crushing us like bugs," he muttered, staring at a single point. "They don't care how many of them fall. 10, 100 for one of ours. They have an endless supply of men." The youngest was Hansi, a 19-year-old boy from Bavaria. He had only been at the front for 3 months. His eyes hadn't yet acquired the murky film of cynicism that the others had. He still believed in the leaflets that spoke of a coming counteroffensive and miracle weapons. He showed Richter a photograph of his girlfriend, the blonde Gretchen, and haltingly described how they would marry after the war. Richter listened, nodded, and felt an icy hand clutch his heart. That day they got lucky. They managed to shoot a deer that had wandered into their position. It was a feast, a true feast. They roasted the meat over a fire, and for a few hours it seemed almost normal. They laughed, remembered home. Gunther even pulled a harmonica from his pack and quietly played an old Bavarian melody. In that moment, they were not soldiers of a doomed army, but simply men, tired of war. But then, from the west, the direction from which they expected help, a lone Focke-Wulf appeared. It dropped no supplies, no mail. It dropped a single pennant with an order. Richter unfolded it. The text was short and clear. Break through to the west independently, in small groups. It was a death sentence. Independently meant without support, without communication, without hope. In small groups meant to die alone. He looked at his men, at their faces illuminated by the campfire's flames. They were waiting. They believed in him. And he already knew that in a few hours, the sound they would hear would not be an enemy shell striking the armor of their hopes, but the dull thud of fate slamming the lid on this green forest coffin. The roar began at dawn. It wasn't just an artillery preparation. It was the end of the world. The earth bucked and heaved. Trees snapped like matchsticks. The air filled with the howl, whistle, and screech of tearing metal. The dugout, their flimsy shelter, shook violently. Dirt rained from the ceiling. It felt as if the world itself had decided to commit suicide. Klaus Richter lay on the floor, pressed into the earth, trying to breathe. Every explosion ruptured his eardrums, knocked the air from his lungs. He felt no fear. Fear had been left behind in a past life. Now there was only one thought. Survive. Just survive this firestorm. When it finally stopped, a silence fell. A deafening, unnatural, ringing silence. They crawled outside. The forest that had been their cover only yesterday was gone. As far as the eye could see, there were only black charred splinters. The ground was plowed with craters. The air was heavy and acrid with smoke. And then they came. The tanks. T-34S. They emerged from the smoke like prehistoric monsters. There were many of them. Too many. Infantry rode on their armor, Russians. They didn't scream "Hurrah!" They were silent. And that silence was more terrifying than any cry. The battle began. Or rather, the slaughter. Their single machine gun choked after a minute. Rifles were useless against tank armor. The soldiers fired, threw grenades, but it was like trying to stop a flood with bare hands. Richter saw Hansi get torn apart by a shell fragment. The same boy who had dreamed of his wedding. He just fell, as if cut down, his eyes staring in surprise at the grey sky. Eric, driven mad, charged with a single grenade onto the tracks of a tank. An explosion roared. The tank stopped, smoke pouring from it, but 10 more followed. Gunther, the old soldier, dragged Richter by the collar into the deepest crater. "That's it, Lieutenant," he rasped, throwing dirt on his commander's face. "The show is over." They sat in that crater, deafened and blinded, until the roar of engines faded somewhere to the west. Silence fell again. Only now it was filled with the groans of the wounded. Out of 18 men, 7 remained. Wounded, shell-shocked, broken. They had almost no ammunition, and no hope at all. That evening they heard Russian voices. Very close. "Hey, Fritzes. Come on out. War's over." The voice was calm, even mundane. Richter looked at his men. Their faces showed only one thing, dull indifference. The war was over for them. He slowly stood up, keeping his hands where they could be seen. 3 men emerged from behind the trees. 1 officer and 2 soldiers with submachine guns. The Russian officer was young, about Richter's age. He looked at them tiredly, then at the bodies of their fallen comrades. "Surrendering?" he asked in German. Richter nodded. The procedure was brief. They were searched, their weapons and watches taken. One of the soldiers tried to pull the wedding ring from Richter's finger, but the officer stopped him with a sharp command. It was the first glimmer of humanity in many days. As they were led east toward a collection point, Richter felt a strange sensation. It wasn't humiliation, not fear. It was relief, a monstrous, all-consuming relief. He no longer had to make decisions, no longer had to fear every rustle in the woods, no longer had to lie in letters to his wife. Someone else was now deciding for him. Captivity seemed like salvation, and that was his greatest mistake. When they were led out onto a main road, he understood why. The road was clogged. Not with vehicles. It was clogged with people. Thousands, tens of thousands of German soldiers and officers trudged eastward. A gray, endless, silent river. This was an army that had ceased to be an army. It was a mob. Richter and his 6 men flowed into this current, became a part of it. And in that moment, he realized, if they wanted to survive, he had to become more than just their former commander. He had to become their anchor in this sea of chaos. The first few days were deceptively bearable. The shock of captivity hadn't worn off, and their bodies, accustomed to the stress of the front, were running on the last of their adrenaline. They walked. They just walked. It seemed that this was the entirety of their new life. There were surprisingly few guards, roughly 1 Russian soldier for every 200 or 300 prisoners. They walked along the sides of the column, lazily bickering among themselves, smoking cheap tobacco, and seemingly paying no attention to the prisoners. Among the Germans, a belief in order in the Geneva Convention still lingered. Officers tried to keep to themselves, to maintain their bearing. Soldiers formed groups based on their former units. The old army hierarchy was still functioning. They were still soldiers, just without weapons. Richter gathered his 6 men. Besides old Gunther, there was Helmut, a medic, a quiet and unassuming man who had miraculously managed to keep his medical bag. There were 4 other soldiers whose names Richter barely knew. "Listen up," he said firmly. "We stick together. We march together. We rest together. Whatever we find, we share equally. No one falls behind. If someone gets weak, we help them. Understood?" They all nodded silently. It was a simple order, but in the encroaching chaos, it was a lifeline. But reality quickly began to show its teeth. On the second day, the food they had carried with them ran out. At stops, they were given a ladle of murky liquid the Russians called balanda, and a piece of black sticky bread. It was catastrophically insufficient. The hunger began. At first, it was just a nagging feeling in the stomach. Then it turned into a dull, aching pain, and after a week it became a thought. The only thought. All conversations turned to food. Men reminisced about their mother's schnitzels, Christmas geese, simple potato soup. They spoke of food with a lust they had once reserved for women. Then came the thirst. The July sun was merciless. Their canteens were empty by the first day. They were only allowed to drink at stops, from rivers or streams, but the stops were infrequent. Men began to drink from puddles on the road, murky, rusty water with dead gnats floating in it. Richter strictly forbade his men from doing this. "Endure it," he said. "Better to suffer from thirst than to die of dysentery." But not everyone listened. He saw men crawl away and, hiding from the guards, lap the filthy water directly from the ground like dogs. And the dysentery came. It cut men down faster than bullets. A man would suddenly turn pale, clutch his stomach, and within a few hours, he would be nothing but a dried-out husk. They were simply left on the roadside. The column marched on. The road began to be covered with corpses. At first it was shocking. Then they got used to it. The dead bodies became as much a part of the landscape as the mangled tanks and burned-out villages. The old hierarchy began to crumble. An officer's epaulets meant nothing anymore. Ranks were erased. Only one rank remained, prisoner. The first conflicts began. Over a piece of bread, over a sip of water. At night, when the column stopped to rest in an open field, the weak and solitary could be robbed or beaten. The guards didn't intervene. For them, whatever happened within that gray mass was not their concern. Their task was simple, to drive this mass eastward. Richter and Gunther established a watch within their small group. While some slept, 2 stayed awake, guarding their meager belongings and each other. It worked. But Richter saw how his men were changing. A wolfish glint appeared in their eyes. Humanity was receding, giving way to animal instinct. The struggle for survival became the only law. One day he saw a colonel, a gray-haired aristocrat with a monocle, fighting a young soldier over a rotten potato he had found in a ravaged field. The colonel won. He sat on the ground, greedily biting into the dirty, raw tuber, and tears streamed down his cheeks. Richter turned away. He realized that their true enemy was not the Russians, not even hunger and disease. Their main enemy was within themselves. And that enemy was just beginning to awaken. By the end of the second week, Helmut, their medic, approached Richter. His face was gray. "Lieutenant," he whispered, "we're almost out of potassium permanganate. The water in these streams is poisoned by corpse venom. If we don't find clean water in a week, we'll all be lying on this road." There was no panic in his voice, just a statement of fact. It seemed all was lost. Hope came from where they least expected it. It came in the form of the quiet, unassuming medic, Helmut. He was no hero. He was a simple paramedic who had worked in a pharmacy before the war. But he possessed knowledge that in these conditions was more valuable than gold. Knowledge of how to fight the invisible enemy, microbes. After his grim warning, Richter gathered his group. The despair was so thick you could almost touch it. "What do we do, Lieutenant?" Gunther asked. His usually steady voice trembled. Richter was silent. He didn't know what to say. Then Helmut spoke up. "We need a fire," he said quietly but firmly. "And mess kits." "Who still has a mess kit?" They had 3 kits among the 7 of them. It was something. "A fire?" one of the soldiers scoffed. "The Russians forbid fires. If they see it, they'll shoot us." "At night, a small one. In a ravine," Helmut replied just as quietly. The idea was insane, but it was the only idea they had. That very night, when the column settled down for the night in a wide hollow, they carried out their plan. Gunther, as the most experienced, found a suitable ravine, hidden from the guards' eyes. 2 other soldiers went in search of fuel. They returned with an armful of dry branches and, a real stroke of luck, a piece of tarred birch bark stripped from a dead tree. Lighting the fire without matches was torture. They spent an hour striking sparks using a lighter flint and a knife blade. Finally, the dry moss that Helmut always carried in his bag began to smolder. A few minutes later, a tiny, barely visible flame danced in the ravine. It was like a sacred ritual. They stared at the fire as if it were a miracle. Helmut directed the process. They collected water from the nearest stream, the very same poisoned water. They filled the mess kits. "We have to boil it for at least 10 minutes, he explained in a whisper. "That will kill most of the germs. Then we'll add a few crystals of permanganate and let it settle." It was their first victory. A small, almost imperceptible one, but no less important for it. They sat around their little fire, drinking the hot, disinfected water, and felt life returning to their bodies. It wasn't just water. It was a sip of hope. In the morning, they saw that several more men in the column were lying on the ground, writhing in abdominal pain. But they were alive. Their system worked. This discovery changed everything. They realized they could do more than just passively survive, surrendering to fate. They could fight back. Their unexpected weapons were not rifles and grenades, but knowledge from civilian life. Helmut became their most precious asset. He taught them to distinguish edible roots from poisonous ones. He showed them how to use plantain leaves to treat their blistered feet. He explained that sphagnum moss, which grew in abundance here, had antiseptic properties and could be used to dress wounds. Richter, the former teacher, realized that his main weapon was organization. He turned their small group into a well-oiled machine. One man was responsible for finding fuel, another for water. A third stood guard during their cooking sessions. Gunther, with his stern demeanor and heavy fists, became the guarantor of discipline. He made sure no one tried to drink more than their share of water or hide any roots they found. They became a family, a strange, tormented family, bound not by blood, but by a common ordeal and a shared will to live. Their example began to infect others. At first, they were watched with suspicion, then with envy, and then people started approaching them. "Lieutenant, may I join your group?" Richter was a pragmatist. He knew they couldn't save everyone, but he also knew they wouldn't last long alone. He began accepting new people into the group, but he set strict conditions: unconditional obedience, surrendering all found supplies to the common pot, and a willingness to help the weak. Not everyone agreed, but those who stayed formed a nucleus, an island of order in an ocean of chaos. But this first victory did not go unnoticed. Not by the guards, no, they didn't care. It was noticed by others, by those who had already crossed the line. Those for whom another's life was worth nothing compared to a piece of bread. And they realized that now they would have to protect not only their lives, but also their fragile hope. Their little state grew and strengthened. By the end of the 3rd week of the march, Richter's group numbered almost 30 men. It was no longer just a group of survivors, but a complex social structure living by its own unwritten laws. Richter was its undisputed head, its brain. He planned, allocated resources, resolved disputes. His word was law. Gunther was his minister of force. He was responsible for discipline and security. A single heavy glance from him was enough to quell any attempt at insubordination. Helmut became the Minister of Health. He oversaw hygiene, treated the sick, and continued his research in the field of botany. They developed their own daily routine, their own ritual. Wake up before dawn. The morning rounds. Helmut would inspect everyone, checking their feet for any signs of disease. Then, the march. During the march, they divided into several subgroups. The strongest and most resilient went ahead as scouts. They looked for water sources, edible plants, abandoned property. In the center was the main group, containing the weakest. They were supported, helped along. At the rear was the rear guard, which made sure no one fell behind and covered their backs. In the evening, at the stop, the most important part began. While some lit the fire and boiled water, others treated wounds, mended clothes and shoes. Everything found during the day, a few potatoes, a handful of wild berries, even a dead crow, was turned over to the common pot. The distribution was a sacred rite. Richter personally divided the food into equal portions, and no one dared to complain. This system gave the men something more than just food and water. It gave them a sense of community, a sense of purpose. They were no longer a mob, but a unit again. They felt like soldiers again, albeit in this strange, twisted war for survival. They even got their own chronicler. A young man, a former philology student who, on scraps of paper found in an abandoned truck, recorded everything that happened to them with the stub of an indelible pencil. He wrote down the names of the dead. He described their route. He documented their small victories and defeats. It was their history, their memory. Richter understood that this chronicle might be the only thing that would remain of them. They learned to survive. They learned to see what others did not. The overturned earth around a shell crater meant that you could find the edible tubers of wild plants thrown to the surface by the explosion. Green grass in a hollow indicated the proximity of groundwater, meaning you could dig a small pit and wait for it to fill with clean, earth-filtered water. They became part of this hostile world. They learned to speak its language. But the stronger their organization became, the more irritation it caused among the rest of the prisoners. They were called the aristocrats, the barons. They were looked upon with envy and hatred, especially in the evenings, when a thin wisp of smoke rose from their hidden fire in the ravine, while the other prisoners chewed on raw roots or simply swallowed their saliva. At night, they had to post reinforced guards. Several times they were attacked by others trying to steal their supplies. Gunther and his guard had to use their fists. It was a brutal but necessary measure. They were defending their world, their order. Their life fell into a harsh but predictable rhythm. They learned to live in hell, but Richter knew that the most dangerous enemy lurked not outside, but within, in the souls of men pushed to their limits, and he waited for that enemy to strike. He just didn't know that the blow would come from a man he had considered a comrade from the very beginning. In the darkness of their small camp, a mutiny began to brew. The mutiny didn't start with a shout, but with a whisper. Its source was Erich, the same corporal from Berlin who had been with Richter in the cauldron. He had survived his mad charge under the tank, escaping with only a concussion and severe burns. He had been with the group from the beginning, but had never truly become a part of it. He followed the rules, but his eyes always held a cold, cynical glint. He was the embodiment of the despair Richter had tried so hard to banish from his group. Erich didn't believe in their system. He saw it merely as a postponement of the inevitable. "We're just prolonging our agony," he would whisper at night to those willing to listen. "We're playing soldiers while death waits for us around the next bend. What's the point of sharing? What's the point of helping the weak? They'll die anyway and drag us down with them. The strongest survive. That's the law of nature. The law of war." His words were poison. They fell on the fertile ground of exhausted souls. The men were tired of discipline, of constant self-restraint. They wanted something simple, to fill their bellies, not to think about tomorrow. The temptation was great. The trigger for open conflict was a discovery. One of the scouts had stumbled upon an abandoned partisan cache. It didn't contain much: a sack of dried bread, a few tins of canned food, and a flask of medical alcohol. By the standards of their world, it was an immense treasure. That evening, when the find was brought to the camp, everyone's eyes lit up. This was salvation. This was a chance to eat their fill for the first time in many weeks. But Richter made a decision that seemed monstrous to many. "We will ration the bread and canned food over a week," he announced. "We will add a little to our usual rations each day. The alcohol goes to Helmut. He needs it for disinfection." It was reasonable. It was pragmatic. But at that moment, the men didn't want reason. They wanted a feast. And that's when Eric stepped forward. "You have no right to decide that," he yelled, his voice ringing with hatred. "We found it. We earned it. We want to eat tonight, not in a week. We might not even be alive tomorrow." A disgruntled murmur of support rose up behind him. About 10 men stood with him. They were the ones who had joined the group recently, who had not yet absorbed its spirit. "He's right," someone shouted from the crowd. "Enough playing at nobility, every man for himself." A tense silence fell. The group was split. On one side stood Richter, Gunther, and the old guard. On the other, Eric and his supporters. This was the moment of truth. Richter looked into Eric's eyes. He didn't see a villain. He saw only an abyss of despair and fear. He understood him. Oh, how he understood him. He himself wanted to say to hell with it all, to open a can of meat and eat it all himself, down to the last crumb. But he was the leader. He could not afford that luxury. "Eric," he said quietly but loud enough for all to hear, "if we start living by the law of the wolves now, we will become wolves. We will devour each other long before this road kills us. Our only strength is in order, in the fact that we are still human. If we lose that, we lose everything. Humanity won't fill our stomachs." Eric spat viciously and stepped toward the sack of bread. At that moment, Gunther moved to stand between him and the sack. He said nothing. He just stood there, immense, immovable, like a rock. His calloused hands slowly clenched into fists. Eric froze for a moment. He knew he couldn't beat the old Feldfebel. The conflict had reached its peak. And then Richter employed what he would later call surgical cruelty. He walked up to Eric and looked him straight in the eye. "You are free to go," he said. "You and everyone who agrees with you. You can leave. Take your share. Here is a can of food and a handful of bread for each of you. But you are leaving the group, right now, and you are never coming back." It was worse than a blow. He was exiling them. He was condemning them to a solitude that here was tantamount to death. Eric and his supporters were stunned. They were not prepared for this. They wanted to rebel within the system, not be cast out of it. One by one, they lowered their heads and stepped aside. Only Eric remained. His face was a mask of hatred and powerlessness. He snatched a can of meat, turned, and without a word, walked off into the darkness. The mutiny was crushed. Richter's law had held, but the victory left a bitter taste. He had defended his order, but he had lost a man. No one slept that night. They sat by the barely glowing embers and said nothing. They had defeated the enemy within. But while they were dealing with each other, they hadn't noticed that their real enemy, this very land, soaked in pain and hatred, was preparing its final crushing blow. The next day they entered a village, or rather, what was left of one. It was a field of ashes, black skeletons of houses, chimneys reaching for the sky like tombstones. The smell of char, even weeks later, still hung in the air. It was one of those thousands of Belarusian villages that had been burned to the ground during punitive operations. The column slowed, drawing into this dead place, and here they were waiting. Not partisans with submachine guns, not soldiers. Women were waiting for them. Old women and young women in black headscarves. With them were old men and children. They stood along the road the column was marching down, and they were silent. It was the most terrible silence Richter had ever heard. There was no fear in it, no curiosity. There was only hatred, pure, concentrated, as heavy as lead. They stared at the prisoners, and in their gazes, the Germans saw a reflection of what their army had done to this land. They saw burned homes, murdered husbands and sons, tortured daughters. Every stare was a verdict. The prisoners lowered their heads. Even the most hardened cynics could not withstand this silent wall of hatred. They tried to look away, at the ruins, but the villagers' gazes seemed to burn right through them. Richter walked with his eyes fixed on his feet. He, a history teacher who had told his students about the great culture of Germany, about Goethe and Schiller, now felt like a descendant of barbarians. The entire veneer of civilization had been stripped away, leaving only shame. A sticky, all-consuming shame. Suddenly a cry tore through the silence. One of the prisoners, not from Richter's group, a young, emaciated boy, couldn't take it anymore. He ran out of the line, fell to his knees before an old woman and held out his empty mess kit to her. "Matushka, bread," he stammered in broken Russian. He was weeping. His shoulders shook with sobs. For a moment it seemed a miracle would happen, that a woman's heart would soften. But the old woman didn't even flinch. Her face was like a stone mask. She simply looked down on him. Then an old man stepped out from behind her. In his hands was a pitchfork. He walked up to the kneeling German and, without a word, swung it and plunged it into his back. The boy gurgled, twitched, and fell silent. Blood slowly spread in a dark patch on his gray uniform. And then hell broke loose. The women who had been standing motionless suddenly came alive. They rushed the column with whatever they had in their hands: oven forks, pokers, stones. Their silence was replaced by a single, prolonged, wailing scream. It was a scream of pain and fury that had been building for years. The column descended into chaos. Prisoners, mad with terror, tried to flee. The guards, caught by surprise, started firing into the air, but it didn't help. The crowd of villagers was uncontrollable. This was not a battle. It was a massacre. Richter and Gunther forced their men into a tight group, pressing against the wall of a burned-out house. "Stick together! Don't panic!" Richter yelled, trying to be heard over the howl of the mob. He saw some officer being stoned to death next to him. He saw women tearing a fallen soldier to pieces. It was a primal madness. He felt an animal terror gripping him. He wanted to run anywhere, but he stood his ground. He was responsible for his men. The chaos lasted for several minutes that felt like an eternity. Finally, a few guards on horseback galloped from the head of the column. They began firing over the heads of the crowd, pushing them back from the prisoners. Gradually, order was restored. The column was formed up again and driven onward, away from that damned village. They walked without looking back. Behind them, several dozen mangled bodies lay on the road. No one uttered a word. Everyone was in shock. They had seen war from the other side. Not from behind the sights of a rifle, but from the side of the victim. And the sight was unbearable. That evening at the halt, Richter sat with his head in his hands. Everything he believed in, order, discipline, humanity, all of it seemed so fragile and meaningless in the face of the primal hatred they had witnessed today. They had survived battle. They were surviving this march. But could their souls survive what they had seen in that burned village? He didn't know. He knew only one thing. This war would never end for them. Even if they reached the camp. Even if they one day returned home. A part of their soul would forever remain there on that dusty road amidst the black ruins under the silent gaze of widows and orphans. After the burned village, something broke irrevocably. Not just in Richter, but in everyone who had witnessed it. The march continued, but it was different. Even the ghostly hope that had flickered in some souls was gone. All that remained was the dull, mechanical task of moving one's feet. Step, another step. The road became infinite. It seemed to lead not to a prisoner of war camp, but straight to hell. Men died more often. Their bodies no longer evoked any emotion. They were simply stepped around. Richter's group held on. Their system still worked, but it was beginning to fail. The men grew silent, withdrawn. There were no more conversations around the fire in the evenings. Everyone just sat, staring into the flames, lost in their own thoughts. Each man was processing the horror alone. Several weeks later, they reached a major railway station. It was the first sign of civilization in a long time, and it was the end of the march on foot. Cattle cars were waiting for them. Teplushkas. Salvation, many thought. But it was just a new circle of hell. 100 to 150 men were packed into each car, so tightly that one could only stand. The doors were bolted from the outside. Inside was pitch-black darkness, a suffocating stench, and a lack of air. The days turned into torture. Men lost consciousness from the stuffiness, died standing up, their bodies remaining wedged in the crowd until the next stop. At stops, the doors were opened for a few minutes. Corpses were thrown out. A bucket of water and a loaf of bread were given to the entire car. Fights would break out. The strong pushed aside the weak. Those who still had the strength to fight survived. Richter's group managed to organize once more. They took over one corner of the car. Gunther and the strongest men stood like a wall, protecting their space. They established a rotation. While some stood, others could sit or lie on the filthy floor. It was their last collective act. But the brotherhood forged on the road was cracking. In the confined space of the car, all human vices were magnified to their extreme. The men became like spiders in a jar. One night, Richter was woken by a quiet gasp. In the darkness, he made out one of his men, the student chronicler, trying to steal a piece of bread from a sleeping comrade. Richter said nothing. He simply took the boy's hand. The boy flinched, dropped the bread, and began to weep silently. Richter didn't punish him. He simply understood that everyone has a breaking point. Finally, after an eternity, the train stopped. The doors opened, and they were blinded by daylight. They had arrived. The camp. Endless rows of barbed wire, watchtowers, barracks. It didn't look like salvation. It looked like a prison. They were herded out of the cars and lined up on the parade ground. The sorting began. Officers to one side, soldiers to the other. The healthy to the work barracks, the sick and exhausted to the infirmary, which looked more like a morgue. Richter watched as his group was torn apart. There went Gunther, still strong despite everything, sent to the column for the able-bodied. There went Helmut, barely able to stand, led toward the infirmary. He tried to shout something to them, but his voice was lost in the general din. He himself, as an officer, was taken to a separate barracks. Camp life began. Interrogations. They were conducted by a young NKVD interrogator who spoke good German. He asked the standard questions: name, rank, unit, participation in crimes against civilians. Richter answered honestly. When asked about the march, he tried to tell the story of his group, of how they tried to maintain order and human dignity. The interrogator listened with a cynical smirk. Dignity? He repeated. You came to our land to kill and rob, and now you speak of dignity. You are all the same, Herr Oberleutnant. Some of you were just luckier than others. Richter realized that no one needed his story. His feat of survival was meaningless. To this system, he was not a man who had lived through hell, but just a number, an entry on a list of prisoners of war. It was the final, most brutal blow. On the march, he had fought against death, hunger, and despair. But here, in this camp, they had taken the very last thing from him, the meaning of his struggle. His brotherhood was destroyed. His achievement was buried alive under layers of barbed wire and official protocols. For him, the war was over, but captivity had begun, and it was more terrible than any war. The years in the camp blurred into one gray, viscous mass. Logging work, meager gruel, cold barracks, scurvy, apathy. Men died not so much from hunger as from hopelessness, from the loss of hope. Richter survived. There was something in him that wouldn't let him break. Perhaps it was the habit of discipline, perhaps stubbornness. Or maybe it was the image of Elsa, which he stubbornly held in his memory. He never saw anyone from his group again. Sometimes rumors reached him. They said that old Gunther hadn't survived the first winter, had died of pneumonia. That Helmut, their savior medic, had survived and was working in the camp infirmary, saving others. The fate of the rest was unknown. They had simply dissolved into the vast Gulag system. In 1949, he and the other surviving Germans began to be prepared for repatriation. It felt like a dream. Returning home seemed unreal, impossible. When he stepped off the train in a ruined, divided Berlin, he did not recognize his country. Everything was foreign. He found his Elsa. She had waited for him all those years. It was the only miracle in his life. He returned to his former profession, once again becoming a history teacher in a school. He tried to live a normal life, but the march would not let him go. It came to him at night in his nightmares. He saw the dusty road, the glassy eyes of the dead, the faces of the women in the burned village. He tried to tell his story. He tried to tell his wife, but she would cry and ask him not to speak of the horror. He tried to tell his friends, but they, having survived bombings and occupation, did not want to hear about the suffering of German soldiers. We all had our own war, Klaus, they would say. He tried to tell his students. Young people, born after the war. He wanted to explain to them that war is not parades and beautiful banners, that it is filth, pain, humiliation, and the loss of all that is human. But they looked at him with bored eyes. To them, it was just a dull history lesson. His story of the suffering of German soldiers on the Eastern Front did not fit into the new worldview being constructed in Germany. In West Germany, they wanted to forget the Nazi past as quickly as possible, focusing on the economic miracle. In the East, they were building socialism and spoke only of the heroism of the Soviet liberator soldiers. Richter's story was inconvenient for everyone. He realized that nobody wanted his truth. He fell silent. He carried his war inside him alone. He died quietly in 1983 from a heart attack. He was buried in a small cemetery in a suburb of Leipzig. His modest headstone bore only his name and dates of life. Not a word about him being a soldier. Not a word about him having led 5 of his comrades through 500 kilometers, about 310 miles of hell. But history does not die, it merely sleeps, only to awaken one day. The official chronicles of the Second World War do not mention Richter's group. There are no records in the archives of his little state on wheels. His feat, like the feats of thousands of others, has been lost to time, buried under tons of reports, orders, and political expediency. But it did not vanish without a trace. It became a legend. A soldier's tale whispered from one survivor to another in the Soviet camps. It was said that on that terrible march, there was an Oberleutnant, a former teacher, who managed to create an island of order in the midst of chaos. A belief spread among the soldiers that those who joined his group were given an extra chance at survival. His name was forgotten, the details blurred, but the essence remained. The story became a myth about the indomitable human will, capable of creating laws and fighting for humanity even in hell. It was said that the symbol of his group was a small mess kit in which they boiled water. For the prisoners, that mess kit became a kind of holy grail, a symbol of hope and salvation. No one knows what became of the chronicle kept by the philology student on scraps of paper. Perhaps it rotted away in the pocket of his uniform. Or perhaps it was found by some Russian soldier who, not understanding what was written, simply threw it away. But one wants to believe that it lies somewhere in some forgotten archive waiting for its moment. This story is not just a chronicle of the survival of a group of German prisoners of war. It is a parable. A reminder that the most important front line is not drawn on staff maps, but within the human soul. It is a story about how even when the world is collapsing, when civilization turns to ash, there are people who try to build a new world on those ruins, even if that world fits into one small group of exhausted men walking an endless road. Was their struggle worth the sacrifice? There is no answer to that question. But one thing is certain. As long as even one person is willing to share their last piece of bread with a dying comrade, as long as they are willing to boil water in a mess kit under threat of death to save others, humanity has hope. Write in the comments what you think of this story. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of history that should never be forgotten.